Thank you, Velma. President Sweeney, trustees, members of the College of Fellows, faculty, students, and guests. A month ago, I got an email from Father Sweeney. And you know, when email pops up on your screen, there's a subject line. And this subject line said, a poet, a lawyer, and an economist theologian. My immediate reaction was he was sending me one of those lifeboat jokes where you try to figure out who gets thrown off the boat first. Now, I'm the lawyer. I had no doubt about what the punchline was going to be. So it was to my great relief when I opened it up, it was an introduction to these talks. Now, of course, I'm well aware that at the end of my remarks, you may feel that the lifeboat joke was actually the best outcome, but there is a question and answer period, and that's your time to weigh in on that. The title of my remarks is Out of Season. There's a paradox in the exhortation of St. Paul in his second letter to Timothy. Preach the word, be diligent in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. When in season, as it was in this country for most of my life, Christian preaching is plentiful, accepted, and easy. But it is in the time out of season when it is rejected that Christian preaching is most difficult and most needed. My distinguished fellows in the colleagues in the College of Fellows speak to the culture in a variety of ways: literature, poetry, academics, film, and many others. The college expresses a truly holistic response to Paul's command. My own background is law, commercial law at that, which is not the best subject for preaching. No one has ever given a homily on commercial law. Rather, my gateway to preaching out of season came in 1998 when, at the request of the Archbishop of Anchorage, I became part of a successful campaign to enact a constitutional marriage amendment in Alaska, and subsequently to recreate the Alaska Catholic Conference. For the latter, I followed in the distinguished footsteps of my colleague, Ned Dulesky, at the California Catholic Conference. Some years later, I was invited to coffee by an evangelical Protestant who wanted to form an Alaska family council following the Focus on Family model to engage the public sphere on critical issues of life, family, and marriage. He wanted Catholic participation, so I agreed to sign up. In the few years since its creation, the Alaska Family Council has had significant elective and electoral and legislative success on life and religious liberty issues. Today, I will focus on marriage as a case study involving huge social attitude changes in just a few years, the task we face in the future. Included in this case study are the mistakes that have been made, the effects the rapid changes in the social order have had on society and individual lives, and an approach for preaching out of season. My remarks are especially addressed to the students of the DSPT, particularly the student brothers, as you prepare for your ministry in the order of preachers. Before 1997, the place of traditional marriage in the United States appeared assured. The sole controversy, and a very brief one, came in the 19th century over polygamy, when Congress allowed the admission of Utah as a state with the condition that polygamy be prohibited. In 1997, however, an Alaska judge ruled Alaska's marriage law unconstitutional because it allowed only marriage between heterosexuals. Several Alaska legislators, in reaction, proposed a constitutional amendment which declared simply that marriage in Alaska was between one man and one woman. Interestingly, the public testimony in the proposed amendment was overwhelmingly against, a harbinger of what was to come. Nevertheless, the proposal passed by over 2/3 of the legislature, as was required, and went on the ballot. An organization was formed to campaign for a yes vote. As I mentioned, the Archbishop asked me and a priest of the Archdiocese to serve on the board, which included a variety of religious groups, including the Mormons, but not the old mainline Protestants. The reaction of many to our efforts was, why bother with such a campaign? The marriage issue was surely a no-brainer and would pass easily. Remember, this is 1997. Indeed, the opposition was lightly funded. There were a few newspaper ads by liberal clergy, plus letter writing and opinion columns in the newspaper, but little money. The bishops of Alaska issued a very effective public statement in support of the amendment, and on Election Day, 68% of the voters voted yes. Alaska was the first in the nation to be followed by 30 states who, by legislation or election, ensured that traditional marriage was the law. This included California, the poster child of the left coast, which, as you know, repudiated the legislature's same-sex marriage law at the polls. So fast forward to today, a mere 17 years later. Everything has been reversed. The homosexual marriage movement is aggressive and well-funded. Legislatures have enacted same-sex marriage laws. States which adopted traditional marriage have reversed their action. And most importantly, the judiciary has moved aggressively to trump any democratic decision by the people imposing homosexual marriage on the nation by fiat. Polls show the rapid change in public attitude, leading many shallow public leaders to evolve from their previous support of traditional marriage to follow the new trend. Even within the church, attempts to uphold church teaching have been met with objection and protest. Along with the change in the political climate comes a new threat. The liberty of individuals, businesses, and churches is being challenged by law. Laws have been enacted and more have been proposed in the name of tolerance to suppress any objection to same-sex behavior. You know of cases where individuals have declined on religious grounds to photograph same-sex ceremonies, provide wedding cakes or other services for such events. Last month, the District of Columbia City Council passed an amendment to its human rights ordinance, repealing protections for religious schools and colleges to determine their own rules regarding gay and lesbian activities. The specific targets are the schools of the Archdiocese of Washington and Catholic University of America. Those who support traditional marriage or disapprove of homosexual activities, as the Catechism of the Catholic Church does, are labeled bigots. In a world turned upside down, a no-brainer in 1998 is bigotry in 2015. This brings me to the second part of this case study, a proposed ordinance that would have added sexual orientation as a prohibited discrimination category to the Anchorage Civil Rights Law. Proponents falsely claimed that churches would be unaffected by the proposed change. Under a similar New Jersey law, a religious group conceded to be a church entitled to religious liberty under the Constitution was found in violation of the law because it refused to rent its facilities for a same-sex ceremony. In Anchorage, after long contentious public hearings, the ordinance passed, but without the votes to override the mayor's veto. Encouraged by their own polling, which showed strong support for such an ordinance, proponents gathered thousands of signatures for an initiative which went on the ballot in 2013. Again, but more aggressively this time, the liberal clergy campaigned for the ordinance. The Alaska Family Council led the opposition on liberty grounds. In another reversal from 1998, we were outspent 3.5 to 1. The polling margin shrank from over 20 points to 9 favorable 10 days before the election. It looked grim, but on election day, the initiative was voted down by a 14-point margin, a 23-point switch in 10 days. We see rapid but contradictory shifts in public attitudes on issues involving legal acceptance of homosexual behavior. For the sudden shift on marriage, a vital factor has been the relentless pressure of postmodern culture. The culture has adopted a libertarian view of sex, totally divorced from and opposed to traditional standards of sexual responsibility and fidelity, which was accompanied by a clear set of rules passed on from generation to generation. The elites have taken up the cause. we, and particularly our children, have been bombarded with the debased sexuality dressed up as liberation. I've been describing the issue of marriage today in the light of the rush to same-sex marriage. Will permitting homosexuals to marry by itself destroy marriage? No. It's only the latest chapter. It merely continues the deconstruction of society's most basic institution. Consider the changes that were already underway. In 1970, 95% of all births were to marriage couples. Last year, only 59% were. Less than half of all kids today, 46%, live with traditional married parents in their first marriage, down from 73% in 1960. You all know cohabitation has been standard before marriage for a long time, if indeed marriage ever follows. Sex has been emptied of commitment and responsibility. My alma mater recently adopted a policy of gender-blind room assignments. What does that tell you? It also sponsors Sex Week every 2 years. All this required mingling to the point of encouraging sex is known as the hookup culture. And finally, it should be no surprise that with all this responsibility-free sex, fueled by the usual steady flow of alcohol on campus, means rampant sexual assault cases, not to mention psychological damage wrought on young people. What kind of education for parenthood is this? Let me issue an indictment against the churches, the Catholic Church in particular. Cardinal Dolan said recently that he hadn't preached on marriage in 40 years. Since shyness is not a characteristic of the cardinal, I take his comment as a self-criticism. I echo that criticism. I can count on the fingers of one hand the times I have heard a homily on marriage in the last 40 years and still have fingers left over. I don't need any fingers to count the times I've heard homilies about Christian principles of sexuality. In truth, the debate over marriage was conceded to the postmodern culture by simply not showing up. We have been living on accumulated moral capital, assuming it would hold, only to see it run out. The silence has had severe negative consequences in two ways. In the public sphere I have described, it is difficult for the laity to make the case for the church's teaching on marriage and the family. This is particularly true when the liberal clergy, aligned with the culture, turns Christian morality on its head. Jesus loves you no matter what you do, therefore the culture should ratify what you want to do. More importantly, the failure to transmit Christian moral teaching is a disaster for family and social life. The devastating impact falls on children for whom the family is created. In his book, The Beginning of Wisdom, Reading Genesis, Leon Kass and his students at the University of Chicago portray Genesis as a pedagogical work. The first 11 chapters are entitled Dangerous Beginnings, The Uninstructed Ways. Human freedom and the rejection of God's command leads to fratricide, the flood, and Babel, the human-centered city. So God turns to the long, hard task of educating humanity in his way, beginning with Abram. Part 2 of the Beginning of Wisdom is entitled Educating the Fathers, the patriarchs, as the basis for a nation, his nation, and thence to the whole world. God's new nation must rest on firm familial grounds. Quote, God's new way includes the crucial elements of marriage, sexual fidelity, the gift of children within marriage, and the right ordering of the household for the well-being of children, essential for the rearing of the next generation, for the transmitting of the way of life that is the spiritual lifeblood of the family and nation. Cass ends the Beginning of Wisdom with his own conclusion of great wisdom. Left to their own devices, unregulated human beings usually get it wrong, injuring their neighbors, defiling themselves, and worshiping idols, end quote. I've spoken about the public struggle, but there's another more fundamental area where the impact has been worse: children. It has been my privilege for the last 26 years to be on the board of Covenant House Alaska. Covenant House is an international Catholic charity begun in Manhattan for runaway and throwaway youth ages 13 through 20. For 40 years, this country has seen a steady decline of the family. Most of our Covenant House youth have never had parents to teach and mentor them for adulthood. These youth don't know how to be parents, but they will be, or at least the girls will. So their children will grow up without the transmission of that way of life necessary for the family and nation. We have a brand new 41,000 square foot building which offers wonderful love and care for our youth, but it can't heal the culture. Preaching on marriage and fidelity can reach people who are aware by their lived experience that the culture's promise of glamour and happiness is false. I mentioned the statistics on marriage, which are sobering and certainly depressing. But it's the anecdotal that really hurts. To hear the tales of our Covenant House kids simply breaks your heart. For the larger picture, I'm pessimistic. Alasdair MacIntyre, in his seminal book on moral philosophy, After Virtue, uses the word incommensurable when referring to modern moral discourse. Incommensurable means that there is no standard by which rival moral claims can be judged. The Enlightenment project divorced faith from reason and eliminated the transcendent as the final standard, leaving reason as the sole means of coming to moral agreement. The Enlightenment project failed. The presupposition of the previous world discourse in Western tradition, shared by Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas, MacIntyre says, quote, is that there exists a cosmic order which dictates the place of each virtue in a total harmonious scheme of human life. Truth in the moral sphere consists in the conformity of moral judgment to the order of this scheme. The contrasting modern tradition holds that the variety and heterogeneity of human goods is such that their pursuit cannot be reconciled in any single moral order, end quote. Although the moral language today sounds like the old moral tradition, the words have been emptied of their old meaning, indeed any meaning. Moral decisions, if that's what they can be called, are made by autonomous individuals. What is left to resolve public moral disputes is power, including now the fiat of a judiciary, and to suppress dissent through the use of law and public pressure. Now, as you know, the Supreme Court has agreed to decide the marriage question this term. Overwhelmingly, the federal courts have ruled against traditional marriage, including in Alaska. One appeals court went the other way, creating a conflict among the circuits which requires a Supreme Court decision to resolve. The court will decide 5-4 that traditional marriage laws are unconstitutional because they violate the Equal Protection Clause. Equal protection became part of the Constitution in 1868 as part of the 14th Amendment, one of the 3 Reconstruction amendments adopted after the Civil War. Congress had enacted a Civil Rights Act to outlaw the black codes adopted by southern states to isolate and deny rights to the newly freed slaves. Congress feared that the civil rights law would be found unconstitutional as beyond the power of the federal government, hence the 14th Amendment. No one believed that equal protection affected marriage, except, of course, where race bands were involved. The Equal Protection Clause is 147 years old. Only in the last few years has it been imagined by some that it now or ever has affected state marriage laws. Here is the first of only 2 things you need to know about constitutional law. Now, this is the Bob Flint short course in American constitutional law, so listen up. The first is that the Constitution is an historical document. You can see it today in the National Archives in the mall in Washington, D.C., but it has nothing to do with constitutional law today. The second thing you need to know is how to count to 5. With this case, you have 4 liberals on one side and 4 conservatives on the other. The fifth is Anthony Kennedy, the perpetual swing vote, who has been the leader in this revolution. So the Constitution is created, recreated, changed, and altered beyond description by 5 unelected lawyers. There is a sliver of optimism in the gloom. Earlier, I described the swift, unexpected changes in public consensus surrounding the Anchorage Sexual Orientation Ordinance. 2 significant things happened just before Election Day. The Archbishop of Anchorage wrote a letter to all parishes and a newspaper column carefully explaining the church's position and the dangers to religious liberty. After the election, people told them that he had clarified the issue for them. They believed the ordinance was wrong but couldn't express why. After the clarification, they changed their intended vote. Proponents had repeatedly claimed that sexual orientation discrimination was a new civil rights issue. Just before the election, 8 prominent black pastors held a news conference. They denied the issue had any connection with the civil rights movement and urged a no vote. So people do listen to religious leaders. The power to change minds has not died out, but you can't influence minds if you don't speak. I have not painted a cheerful or optimistic picture of our postmodern culture. The gospel has to be preached to a culture which has hardened its heart to its message. That doesn't change our duty to speak. God has assigned responsibility. We are to preach the gospel unceasingly. The outcome is up to him. John Paul II, in his visit to Anchorage in 1981, called upon the assembled crowd to bring forth vocations to preach the gospel to the men and women of this generation who have turned away from the mercy of God's love. We should be open to God's surprises. Woody Allen once said, making predictions is difficult, especially about the future. There are surprises yet. In sum, the postmodern culture has wrought great damage to the bedrock institutions of our society and the individuals in society, especially children. As Leon Cass said, the elements necessary for the spiritual lifeblood of the family and nation have been discarded. Transmission to the next generation has been broken. We have been caught empty-handed. We assumed the accumulated wisdom of the past would hold. We completely underestimated the destructive power of the Enlightenment inheritance. This mistake must not be continued. Perhaps a real opportunity exists to correct this grievous mistake. The Ordinary Synod of 2015 on marriage and the family got off to a rocky start last year, and last year's Extraordinary Synod. Proposals published in the so-called interim report urged accommodation on sexual matters with the zeitgeist. The final report corrected this drift, so the Synod appears poised for serious discussion based on the long teaching and experience of Scripture and the Church. George Weigel has an insightful article between 2 synods in this month's First Things. Quote, "The proposals afford pastors and bishops a remarkable opportunity to recatechize, or in many instances catechize, their people about marriage, the Eucharist, and penance. Pastoral letters on these subjects would be helpful, but nothing is more important here than effective preaching." Where do the laity fit into all this? We fit in by engaging the culture in the myriad of ways followed by the College of Fellows, in ordinary professional and family life, and in the public sphere with my involvement as a small example. I would add another duty. Pester your pastor, and for an extra, pester your bishop too. We need and want preaching on the family, sexuality, responsibility, and fidelity. Tell them we need and want the church to speak. It works. On the last Sunday of the year, the Feast of the Holy Family, one of our great friars preached on the family. I complimented him on the homily. He said he remembered my complaint about hearing little such preaching in the last 40 years. Finally, educate your children. Transmit God's way of life to the next generation. Postmodern life has everything backwards. For millennia, childhood was a time for parents to educate their children. Now it often seems to be a time for children to educate their parents on current trends. In fact, there seems to be little serious education either way. So I end where I began, preaching that educates and transmits God's way with the confident assurance that God alone knows what is good for man. Preach the word, be diligent in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort, with all long-suffering and doctrine.
Do we have a microphone for people? I welcome anyone's comment in response to it, the fellows perhaps, or those of you, or if you have a question you'd like to raise. The first one is always the most difficult. Please.
I have a sort of comment question. I think I'm part of the generation that was literally broken in the transmission of the tradition. And the one thing I didn't hear you say, but you alluded to it several times, it seems quite clear to me that the break happened through the media for many people, that cultural values became the transmission of the media. And I would just be curious if you or the other fellows have any thoughts about that vis-a-vis your thought of evangelize, rebuke, and et cetera.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And of course, in my general comments about the postmodern culture, that's definitely a part of it. Well, my own personal experience is that we were rather late in life, due to the death of a friend, we became the parents of a 6-year-old girl who is now 18. So I had not listened in any way to modern music. And when you get a teenage girl, you do, and in fact, you have to monitor it very closely and cut some of it out. It's true, they can understand the words, and I can't understand most of them, but the words I can understand are vile. I mean, they're just awful, and they're awful to women. So, and this is, was foreign to me when I was growing up. So I absolutely agree, and I would assume becoming a parent after a long interval and looking at the changes and what you basically have to do to protect these kids, it was astounding to me. So I'm with you. It's absolutely true. Yes.
My husband and I teach our children about marriage being between one man and one woman, and yet we have my brother-in-law living with his partner, and we don't talk about it. We get together for Christmas and Thanksgiving. So what do you suggest that we handle the situation we are in? I mean, I see that it's not unique to my family, and as our kids get older, they ask, how come Uncle Gary lives with Uncle Jerry? So it's not.
Well, it can be difficult. As far as, personal interaction, on my daughter-in-law's side, there was a same-sex commitment ceremony. I didn't attend it. But, of course, they were involved in the family activities. And, as far as I'm concerned, the family activities, and you, you know, shoot the breeze and talk and treat each other as you would anybody normally. Now, and our daughter was there, you know, all this time, and all I can say is, I was fortunate she never asked the question. So I was never put in the position of, you know, going through some, you know, appropriate, balanced way, how you handle this. And the only short thing I can answer right now is, you know, we have these certain fundamental beliefs, and they're for good reason. We also respect everybody. And so we hold those people in complete respect and friendship, although we might not agree with all they do. And of course, that lesson's universal. I mean, there are a lot of people that they may have friends with, and we don't agree with those behaviors, and we control them by not letting them go to the movies or whatever you do with teenage kids. But that doesn't mean that they can't be friends or they can't respect them. So I think this appropriate thing, and we do that all the time in the world, you know. We have our beliefs. This is why they're there. We respect other people. So. Yes, Father? No.
I'm not married. I belong to Marriage Encounter, however. What would you say that married people gave the sermons on this issue? We can go to the bishop and get permission and get, we may not want to call it preaching, but we may call it giving some reflections, and have them do most of it. Oh, not most of it, but let's have them give the talks. Because if they are married, they would have perhaps some more acceptance by a large group of people who are themselves married or thinking about it, or thinking about the structure that they want to live in.
Yes, I agree. I think that's an excellent idea. But I think, as you indicated, that's an addition to, not a substitute for, preaching by the clergy. And since we're so far behind on this matter, the more the merrier. And what I found in these few times is when the priest does talk about marriage, he's got a number of people waiting for him at the sacristy thanking him for it because there's been such a dearth of it. I think there are people who want to hear it. And of course, it's not just marriage. Let me go back to my alma mater, one of the oldest universities in the country. What does it do to a young person to go into that environment where there's not only approval of all this sort of thing, but an actual encouragement for people who really don't want to do it, but the culture is pressing them to do it? And what type of a damage does that do? Well, I can tell you, not just from, you know, normal people who are not in Covenant House, but a lot of people that I see, the damage is immense, absolutely immense. And it's not theoretical either. I mean, these are real people. So you have to cover a lot of the bases. You know, one of the things I didn't indicate in my tirade were Catholic schools. I mean, I think the collapse of the Catholic school system in the last 40 years is an absolute disaster for the church and society. Not only the collapse of the schools in numbers, but the collapse of the curricula, which doesn't transmit it either. But we need to pull out all the stops, I would say. Yeah, Russ.
Yes. Let's suppose we're at the end of June. Oh, sure. Only when I say, in the name of the Father.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so let's spin the reel ahead. It's the end of June, and in California time, you're going to hear about the Supreme Court decision pretty early in the morning. And well, in Alaska as well, pretty early in the morning.
Yeah.
And it is, just as you say, 5 to 4, and for the very reason you gave, equal protection clause. And you were at the microphone. What are the first 4 or 5 sentences you're going to say to the press?
This is sort of a family gathering, isn't it? You wouldn't want me to say what I was actually thinking. Well, I mean, I have two feelings about it. Both of them are very strong. I mean, the one on marriage that I expressed, and it's the destructive effect that this cumulatively has. But the other thing is that, you know, I've been around lawyers for over 50 years, and I came into it with the naive belief that this American experiment was created as a democratic republic, that it was the people who were deciding their institutions and their big social issues, and that over time, and particularly lately, the court has usurped, taken for itself, what issues to be decided and how they're to be decided. And those principles of decision are absolutely untethered to anything people thought was in the Constitution that they created. My nasty comments in some of my columns have said, this document begins, we the people, not we the judges. So I think this is destructive to what has been one of the best experiments on this planet. So those are my mild comments. Yeah.
Would you,
Nope.
Go ahead. Let me have a short question just to follow up on that, because after that press conference where you're going to be speaking, I want you to look out ahead, because with the new doctrine on contract being the only basis for any marriage or any other grouping, what is the next movement to polygamy?
Oh, it's not polygamy. No, there's a new term. It's polyamorous. Polygamy is traditionally one man and several women, although I think it's sometimes been used, you know, for the opposite. But that's not the end of it. I mean, why be limited to one? I mean, the principles are all the same. So, and there are groups, there are flags and symbols and people ginning up all this stuff, and so it's polyamorous marriage with a group of people. Same arguments. So now, will it happen? I mean, there's some other principles of law in the DOMA case, the defense of marriage case. Scalia, in his dissent, Scalia doesn't mush words either. He said, this court will do anything it thinks it can get away with. So, can they get away with polyamorous marriage? If so, I mean, the principles are the same. So, yeah, I mean, that's what's coming down the pike. Now, I must say, in one sense, as a lawyer and having been in private practice, I cannot imagine a gold mine bigger than that for domestic relations attorneys. You know how hard it is to deal with two people. He's got several. I mean, it's a retirement fund that won't quit giving. Yes.
I'd like to go back to this moment when the declaration is in favor of it.
The court?
The court. And I know you're an advisor to the Archbishop in Alaska and probably elsewhere as well. Would you think that a movement could grow under the jurisdiction of the bishops, that the Roman Catholic Church would give up its right to function as a justice of the peace in civil marriages, and basically just privatize, if you will, marriage because of the difficulties that you've suggested, the theological difficulties, et cetera, and in effect no longer ask that we insist that marriage in the United States be both a religious and a civil contract, and that people who are married in the Catholic Church are married in a religious ceremony and then register as for civil purposes and are covered under the law under that. And that would, in effect, allow, if you will, a separate but equal track for Catholics or Christians or people of any position who don't agree with the same-sex marriage.
I have some problem with that because I think in some of the quotes I mentioned in my talk, and also really sort of the basis of the College of Fellows is that we're supposed to be engaging and trying to help the culture, and the church itself is not a ghetto. I mean, we're not the Amish. I mean, we're out there not only talking to our own people, but after all, we're supposed to be God's preachers, telling people what their problems are and what's, it's just, why are we any different from the Old Testament prophets? And what did they do? I mean, they did it just like they did your little kid, If you do that, that's a bad thing and you're going to suffer like mad, So it seems to me that we do have a duty to stay in the culture, however hard it is, for the benefit of the culture. And particularly, and I'm big on these kids for what I do and for what I've heard from them. And their fix is not the way the culture is going now.
Well, we've learned to live with the abortion ruling. How many years? 50 years, and that's equally
73, yeah, 1973.
That's equally as repellent to
Yep.
us. And I understand. I can't quote scripture. I don't have the background.
Yeah.
There comes a point when you shake the dust of the village from your
True.
feet.
Yep.
And as Jesus advised,
Yeah.
at the point he said you have to be both like a serpent and a dove.
Yeah.
And there comes a time when we try the serpent and the dove response. There might be a time that we don't want the serpent. We don't want the violence. How are we going to live in this culture as in battle of minority or not become the Amish if indeed we are overwhelmingly defeated by the courts under the system that we have now? Again, I'm not approving of these things.
No, your point's very well taken, and I just said I had reservations about it, but I mean that, it certainly may come to that. I mean, obviously the baseline here is that we have to keep our integrity. I mean, we're not sent out, and the apostles weren't sent out to preach to the world what the world wanted to hear. So, and they may reject it, but as long as we find the format to do that, then I would hope that we're fulfilling the command. But and it may come to that. I hope not, but.
Two very quick questions.
Yeah.
So you've intrigued us all.
Oh.
Where did you go to college? What is your alma mater?
I'm sorry, what's that?
The alma mater that you mentioned?
Oh, Yale. Yeah, and in fact, you remember Bill Buckley's book, God and Man at Yale, back from 1950? Well, there's a book out about 2 or 3 years ago by a student who had just graduated from Yale, and it was called, I think, Sex and Man at Yale. And it was all about this sex week stuff that goes on and portraying in dreary reality what the university does and what it tolerates. And, I mean, I read that it's an entirely different place. I mean, educationally, and the respect for learning in the scriptures. And now the university's running around with, prostitutes and porn stars and all that sort of sponsoring all this stuff. What happened to this place? It reminds me, you remember Daniel Moynihan's famous comment, defining deviance down? Well, of course, he was right. The only thing he didn't tell us is how far down is it going to go? It hasn't stopped yet. And so 1701, I mean, this is one of the oldest, most established and respected universities in the country, and it does that sort of stuff.
Well, my more substantial question, I've never been to Alaska or within 500 miles, maybe others can share that. And I recently heard Alaska described as the, I don't know, perfect breeding ground or the home ground of libertarianism, obviously a philosophy of you can do anything you wish with your body, and you address that well, but also with your money, your resources. I don't know what the tax rates are or the program availability is. And could you just make a few comments about how that has affected, or maybe a political culture of libertarianism may or may not have affected Alaska politics?
Well, first of all, let me just briefly, and it doesn't have to be long, let me tell you about the tax structure in Alaska as far as people paying taxes. They don't pay taxes. So, in fact, they get money from the government in the form of the dividend. Now, this was when oil was $100 a barrel. We're in the tank now, so the refugees are going to be coming south very soon. Be prepared for them. You know, actually, Alaska is a very eclectic state. Yes, there's strong libertarian tenets that follow along with this, in this vein. On the other hand, it's also, surprisingly, because this wasn't true at statehood, it's now a very red state. I mean, it is probably breaks normally about 60-40 Republican over Democrat. And although it's, let's see, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, I think, are the least religious states in the nation. And yet, in Alaska, our, which I've mentioned in one case, and there's some others, get a very respectful and useful hearing from the public, from the religious leaders when they speak. And that ordinance issue was an outstanding example. I mean, if you're ever in the political arena, a switch of 23 points in 10 days on a very high-profile, contentious matter is astounding. But it also tells you something. First of all, people were uncertain. And second, when religious leaders spoke up and said it carefully, people listened. So it's an oddball state.
In case that's heartening to you, I did preach on that repeatedly, including in San Francisco. But people are not precisely lining up at the sacristy to thank you for it. Well, but I do have one short comment, which might be a bit disheartening, and a question. The first one is, I don't think the next thing is polyamory, really. The next thing is incest. And I have said that a few years ago, and people would call that alarmist, but the Ethics Council of Germany, that comes out of both chambers of the legislature, now recommends to the government to legalize it and all that comes with that. And you can imagine what that is going to do to family life.
Oh, yeah.
So there's more to come, in other words. But my question is very different, and that is, you mentioned the stories that you hear from children, and I think the stories of children and their perspective and their interests are usually the one that's what is least considered. And so I wonder if you could tell us one or two stories that are foremost in your mind that you remember from what you have heard.
Of course, there are lots of different, and there are a lot of the real hard ones. I mean, sexual and physical abuse and all that sort of stuff. But one that sticks out in my mind was last year when our national president came up and was in the old building before we moved into the new building. And he went around talking with the kids who were in residence there, and he was talking to a 16-year-old girl. And she pulled out of her pocket a big birthday card that she had had a birthday. It might have been a month before. And it was signed by the staff and all the other kids and stuff, and happy birthday. And she said to him, she said, I've never had a birthday before. Now, wait a minute. A 16-year-old child, there's been no one to care enough about her that they couldn't have given her a birthday? I mean, I think that's devastating, absolutely devastating. But of course, there are the good ones too. One thing I remember, again in the old building, the executive director had her office was on the corner, overlooked the town square. And there's this big window, and And she looks out the window, and here's this young woman with her arms wrapped around the corner of the building, and she thinks, oh boy. But she goes out and, gingerly goes up and says, may I help you? And it turns out this woman was about early 20s, was moving out of the state, getting on the airplane. And she said, this place saved my life. So we do help people in the disaster. So those are, some of the good ones and some of the bad ones. One of the ones I remember in our new, when we grand opening, we had the kids transfer over from the old place, and our chairman, a great woman, was talking to the kids, and one kid said, I don't understand why I have the life I have. I don't understand why I had the parents I had. I said, there was one thing I really don't understand. And Kate sort of gets a little tense. Oh, what? He says, I don't understand why strangers would do this for me. Everybody's been a stranger in that kid's life.
Thank you, Bob.
Excuse me.